Red Velvet Prologue. The scent of blood hung thick in the night air, fear tightening like a heavy noose around the throats of any living beings in the area, and sending them running for safety. Like there was any safety left to be found now. The blood scent was stifling and constricting like the malevolent mist cast by a witch, as it mingled with tendrils of acrid smoke that whispered into the chilly winter sky. It felt like the atmosphere itself had turned against all the life forms it had once held dear, and was trying to squeeze the very life out of anything and everything that was not already dead. The dusty earth was tinted red by the blood moon that seemed to hang within grabbing distance above, appearing as a grim testimony of what had happened here, silent and satisfied as a master, who had trained its pupil well and was now taking in what they were capable of with pride. The dying embers of several small fires flickered here and there across the clearing set beside the worn dirt road. This particular winding road that slithered deep and daunting into the thickest parts of the woods had long been forgotten and abandoned by any with a half sense of self-preservation, leaving its surface cracked and uneven from years of being neglected. The long scars from heavy wagon wheels that were left unattended like festering wounds, its only reminder of the greatness it once held. The clearing had been a makeshift camp not too long ago. One could still detect the faint sense of alcohol, dried meat, half-cooked and burnt sourdough bread, mingled with the telltale signs of many male humans. Sweat, bad breath and body odor all mashed together. The men who had set up camp here had not even bothered to hide themselves away from being spotted by fellow travelers. For there were no fellow travelers in these parts. Especially not ones who could be a threat to the men who used to run this burnt-down operation. Burnt down, and slaughtered. Aside for the glowing red moon that hung above, like an angry wound, the clearing was lit by one large fire still raging in the middle of the bare-torn earth. It was not as much the remains of a campfire, but more the remains of what could have been a wagon of sorts. Maybe if it hadn't been so severely damaged and burnt to no more than a black-brown mass of charred plank and fabric, one could better discern what it had once been. Not that anyone would bother sticking around to contemplate the damage done and wonder what had caused it. Not after they had had one mere glance at the massacre. There was no sign of horses and oxen. They had broken free before the storm hit. Animals always knew when danger was coming. Bodies littered the ground, so torn apart and broken that they too were also nearly undiscernible. But there was no mistaking what they were. The blood was clear enough. Spilled and splattered over every surface in sight, painting cruel patterns on the nearly winter-bare trees and covering the sides of the still-standing tents, turning the ground into a muddy red bog in more places than not. No sane human would even come close enough to grasp at one glance. No one would risk it, whether they were from the nearby villages or from one far away. Every collection of humans was one of superstition. No one would enter the circle of carnage even if you promised them the riches of the world, not under the blood moon and not within the hour of the witch and wolf. The scent of smoke, death and fresh spilled blood on the wine was enough to make even the toughest man spill his guts. Not even the chill wine seemed to want to dare make a move though, and the haze of carnage hung heavy as a storm cloud, even though the storm was clearly over. The young girl sat to the side of the clearing, her back shrouded in night and features bathed in the orange glow from the still burning fire. Her body was bare, her clothes shredded and torn until there had been nothing left. It was hard to tell that she was bare though, blood splattered and bathed her clammy skin, making her look like a prophetic depiction of a harbinger of death, an angel child donned in a gown of blood and destruction. To the passer-by she might have looked like just another one of the corpses, propped up strangely as she sat unmoving on the dusty patch of ground beside the worst of the bloodshed. The man stepped from the darkness a little off to her left and she shifted, lifting her eyes from the wreckage and up to him. Eyes as vivid dark red as the darkest smears on the blood moon. Eyes that held no emotion, no fear, and no remorse. The man too showed no fear or emotion, only the grim line of his mouth betraying his concern as he surveyed the scene. But his dark brown irises held a glimmer of sympathy and warmth as he met the little girl's blood and unblinking stare. He took a step closer, not flinching when her eyes started to glow the brighter red as she zeroed in on his location, every muscle coiled, like the predator she was. She wasn't afraid of him, she knew she could take him, felt it in her very being, in the elongating fangs that slid into her mouth, in the claws that pricked from her fingertips and sunk into the powder-like ground below her palms like in was no more then fresh cream giving way under a knife. She could gut him like the other men, rip him to pieces and splash his blood across the ground like wine from a bucket if she pleased. And oh, how she pleased. He seemed to realize what she was thinking, and stopped his advances, being careful not to take a step backwards or make any sudden moves that could pique her hunting instinct further. He lifted his hands in a show of surrender, showing her that he bared no weapon, and slipped free of his dark leathery hood, so that she could see his face. Part of her relaxed instantly when she recognized the neat bearded man that stood before her. This man was familiar to her. He was no danger, a part of her mind remarked. The other part contemplated if she should kill him too, not because of necessity, but just because. Goosebumps traveled up her arms and back, fur picking at the pores of her skin, begging for release as the animal inside of her leaned forward in interest at the prospect of a new plaything. Her eyes drifted past the man, to one of the bodies of the men she had killed. His blood lay in a pool around his body and gaping wounds showed bone and entrails in places. She swiped her tongue over her blood-stained lips, in a fashion more wild animal than human child as she reveled in the coppery sweetness of blood tainted with fear. That man had been one of her more boring kills, she thought. She had wanted to kill these men, had loved it, had rejoiced at the feel of their flesh giving way under her sharp claws and lethal fangs. Their blood had tasted like honey in her mouth and she had drunk it with glee, every other sensation slipping away until it was just her and her sustenance. She had felt like one of the drunken men she had frequently seen indulging themselves in intoxicating drinks at the tavern in her village, carefree and exuberant. She wondered if the man's blood would taste as good as theirs. She looked back up at him, contemplating with her head tilted slightly to one side. The man was holding his cloak out towards her in a silent question. Warmth rolled from the fur-lined inner of the garment, and the smells of wood smoke and human wafted towards her. The girl inhaled, testing the meaning of the different scent with her new heightened emotions. It smelled like home, not her home but one she was familiar with. She longed to bury her face into the lining of the cloak, pulled it close and curled up like the child she was. The foggy memory of fall asleep in front of a crackling fire in a place that was homey and safe swam over her vision and a single tear scurried down her cheek, running fast like a rag dashing over hot roof tiles on a midsummer day. The soft press of a fur-pelt carpet beckoned her, even though it was nowhere in sight. She had done this frequently enough, accepted the man's cloak to keep warm, spent nights napping in front of the fire on that soft bare pelt, but she didn't move to take the cloak now. Instead, the only human response she seemed able to muster was to blink once as longing began to hollow out her heart with an old wooden spoon. The prick and prod of the splintered wood bringing a few more tears out of hiding. A whimper came from the direction of an intact half of the wagon, shrouded in shadow a distance away from the blood-lit clearing. It was shoved so far away from the light of the clearing and nearly invisible to the naked eye, like the woods themselves had tried to close in around it. Its front half had been entirely ripped off, like something had exploded from inside it, and the remaining half had been pushed deeply into a prickly patch of trees, as if something desperately wanted to protect whatever was inside. The girl jerked her head around and focused on the sound, roaming her senses into the surrounding darkness, seeking out the source of any possible danger. The man took his opportunity with her attention turned away from him, closing the distance between them and wrapping the cloak around her small frame like a heavenly blanket. She instinctively relaxed, her body going semi-limp as warmth returned to her bones and she breathed in the comforting sense that clung to it, feeling shielded by the man's bulky form. An underlying tone of burned incense was embedded into the fur and leather, that hadn't been there before she thought. It was almost undetectable under the homey smell of pine and cedar, and it came to her attention that she should struggle and fight, but a numbness had already blanketed her thoughts, making her unwilling to react to anything. She didn't grumble and cry into the man's shoulder as she had done so many times before, as he scooped her up in his arms and began walking to the half of the wagon that sat in the shelter of darkness. Instead she simply turned her head to look over his broad shoulder, back at the clearing, her dark red eyes seeming to grow even darker as they took in the sight of the blood she had spilled. Even as they faded into the soothing darkness of the woods, with the man's heavy boots crunching through the shriveled undergrowth, his determined walk rocking her in a familiar rhythm as he carried her, soothing her with a father's silent lullaby. Her sights remained locked on the vision of blood and fire, taking in every detail, memorizing everything she had done, everything she was capable of.